March 23, 1945. Dawn breaks cold and gray over the western bank of the Rhine, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stands inside a command post that smells of mapping, wet wool, and cigarette smoke. For months he has treated this river like a locked gate to Germany's heart, something you do not touch until the keys are forged, polished, tested, and placed in the correct hands. Operation Plunder is his masterpiece of order. Nearly 1 million men positioned with deliberate precision, 4,000 guns waiting to speak in one coordinated voice. Bombers queued to tear the far bank apart. Engineers ready with bridging equipment stacked like an industrial promise. It is supposed to be the main Allied blow, the crossing that makes the world understand who is driving the final campaign. Then an aide arrives too quickly, holding a slip of paper as if it burns. A radio intercept, brief, clinical, unforgiving. Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim last night. Bridgehead secured. Minimal casualties. For a moment, the room does not move. Montgomery reads it again, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something sensible. They do not. Patton has gone across in the dark. No grand bombardment, no airborne curtain, no massive rehearsal. Just assault boats slipping into a black river, while Montgomery's proper crossing is still waiting to begin. Worse, the news is already loose. Bradley has allowed it to leak toward the press at the precise moment it will do the most damage. It is not only a military message, it is a political knife, and it has been slid between the ribs with practiced accuracy. If Montgomery's operation is a symphony, Patton has shown up early and stolen the applause before the first note. This is the story of the rivalry that burned under the Allied victory parade, the contest that began long before the Rhine and reached its sharpest edge in the final push into Germany. Because the question was never only who crossed first. It was whose way of war would be remembered as the way that won. By the time the Western Allies reached the Rhine, Bernard Montgomery and George Smith Patton Jr. had been grinding against each other for years, two command philosophies trapped in the same coalition. Montgomery, Britain's most celebrated battlefield commander, built his reputation on method and certainty. He believed in careful planning, crushing preparation, and attacking only when the odds were so heavily stacked that failure was almost embarrassing to imagine. He did not call it caution. He called it professionalism. His victories had been engineered, not improvised. Tight organization, heavy artillery, patient execution, and a strict control of the story his army told. Patton was the opposite in nearly every visible way. He believed speed was a weapon, audacity a form of protection, and hesitation the most dangerous luxury a commander could afford. He attacked as if the enemy's balance could be broken by sheer momentum. And he treated the operational timetable like something to be bent, not obeyed. His reputation across France, particularly in the late summer of 1944, had turned him into a legend. Hundreds of miles covered in weeks, German positions collapsing not because they were delicately dismantled, but because they were outpaced, outflanked, and overwhelmed by the relentless pace of an army that rarely paused to admire its own success. To Montgomery, Patton's style looked reckless, undisciplined, showy, and too willing to gamble with lives that could never be replaced. To Patton, Montgomery looked like everything that strangled initiative: slow movement, endless preparation, and a hunger for control that felt like a hunger for credit. Their nation's military cultures only widened the gap. Britain, fighting since the beginning and scarred by casualties, valued controlled operations that promised the best chance of success at the lowest cost. America, arriving with enormous material strength and deep manpower reserves, could afford a higher tempo and a greater tolerance for risk. Both sides told themselves they were being rational. Both looked at the other and saw arrogance. Their tension had simmered through North Africa, where personalities and national pride clashed in cramped headquarters and desert heat. It intensified in Sicily, where speed and glory became a race and humiliation became a souvenir neither man could forget. By the time the Allied front reached Germany's western barrier, it was no longer just professional disagreement. It was personal. Each man's success felt like the other man's embarrassment, and the coalition forced them to stand shoulder to shoulder while quietly competing for history's verdict. In early 1945, the Rhine became the final stage for their argument. Supreme Commander Dwight David Eisenhower, balancing politics as much as strategy, gave Montgomery priority for the main crossing in the north. The operation was designed to be unmistakable, a set-piece assault that could not be ignored by the press, by Berlin, or by Allied governments. Operation Plunder would be the centerpiece. It would be supported by the largest airborne drop since Normandy, a dramatic hammer meant to shatter the last major natural defense before Germany's interior. Montgomery planned it like an engineer building a bridge over chaos. Since the start of the year, he had assembled vast forces along a broad front near Wesel, positioning British, Canadian, and American units under his army group. He massed artillery until the numbers stopped sounding like warfare and started sounding like an industry. He stockpiled bridging equipment, ammunition, fuel, and supplies in mountains that suggested the crossing would not be a question of courage, but of logistics. Nothing would be left to chance. The river would be crushed under preparation. Patton's Third Army, meanwhile, had been assigned the supporting role, the kind that might matter strategically, but rarely shines in headlines. After driving through the Siegfried Line and hammering German forces in the Saar-Palatinate fighting, Third Army reached the Rhine farther south near Mainz. Eisenhower's guidance through Omar Bradley was clear. Patton could cross when opportunity presented itself, but Montgomery's northern crossing remained the official main effort, with the schedule pinned to March 23rd. Drew Pearson opened his weekly broadcast with a story designed to explode. He reported that Lieutenant General George S. Patton had struck a soldier in a field hospital in Sicily. He said Patton had been severely censured by Eisenhower. He added that he did not expect Patton to be used in important combat again. The news hit America like a thrown brick through a window. Pearson was famous for breaking what others avoided. He had sources, and he did not respect agreements he had not signed. By the next day, Eisenhower's headquarters issued a statement saying Patton had never been reprimanded at any time by Eisenhower or by anyone else in that theater. It was a careful denial. Technically, Eisenhower had written a letter of censure, not a formal reprimand. The wording was true. The spirit was evasive. And it fooled almost no one. Montgomery returned the contempt in his own way. He believed Patton was dangerous, not because Patton lacked talent, but because Patton's talent was fused to impulse. Montgomery believed Americans, especially their most aggressive leaders, struck too quickly without the careful groundwork that prevented unnecessary casualties. To him, Patton's swagger was not leadership. It was theater, and theater was expensive in blood. Bradley was trapped between them. He had known Patton since their early military years and understood both his brilliance and his exhausting pride. Bradley also understood Montgomery's obsession with control and the political maneuvering that came with it. Importantly, Bradley shared a distinctly American irritation at British claims and British demands. When Bradley gave Patton permission in the third week of March to take the Rhine on the run, if he could, the decision carried more than operational meaning. Both men understood what it would do. If Patton crossed before Plunder, it would not only open another gateway into Germany, it would challenge the idea that the river required a grand production. It would turn Montgomery's carefully prepared centerpiece into a performance that arrived late. March 21st, 1945. Patton's army stood on the western bank after a brutal, fast-moving campaign that had shredded German resistance in the Palatinate. Prisoners had been taken in the tens of thousands. Now, the 60 reporters who had kept the story quiet were forced to explain themselves. Some admitted they had made an agreement. Others tried to frame it as patriotism. Some simply stayed silent, uncomfortable at being judged for a decision made in wartime shadows. The question became brutal and simple. Would Eisenhower sacrifice Patton to satisfy the politicians? Or would he stand by the general he believed America needed? Eisenhower refused to break. He sent a message to the War Department defending his decision to retain Patton. He argued that Patton was too valuable to lose. He cited the results in Sicily. He admitted Patton had failed as a man in that moment, but insisted his ability as a combat. German forces there seemed battered and disjointed, too exhausted to build the kind of layered defense Montgomery expected in the north. Reports suggested only scattered units, remnants more interested in surviving than in dying for a collapsing Reich. Patton decided almost immediately. He did not want a proper crossing. He wanted a foothold, a bridgehead, something that could grow. He summoned a corps commander and gave the kind of order that made staff officers look for the hidden page with the real plan. They would cross at night. No extended artillery preparation, no loud buildup, no show, just boats, infantry, and speed. The protests began at once. Too little time to organize, too risky without preliminary fires, too dangerous if the Germans were waiting. Patton cut through it with the sharp impatience of a man who believed delay was more lethal than bullets. He did not want perfect. He wanted done. And despite the impression that this was a sudden impulse, Patton had been preparing for such a moment since the previous summer. As Third Army raced across France, he had ordered his staff to gather assault boats, bridging supplies, anything that could be dragged forward and hidden among the rolling tide of logistics. Those resources followed him for months, like a secret weapon tucked beneath the official plans of higher headquarters. When Patton reached the Rhine, he did not need to request the tools. They were already there, waiting. The clock mattered as much as the river. Montgomery's plunder was set to begin the night of March 23rd. If Patton crossed on the night before, he would beat Montgomery by enough hours to dominate the story. But there was a knife edge to the gamble. A failed crossing would not just cost lives. It would vindicate Montgomery's entire argument. It would prove that the Rhine punished impatience. Patton's crossing had to succeed cleanly and quickly, or it would become a cautionary tale told with British satisfaction. Orders went out. A veteran infantry division received the mission. The men were experienced, hardened by months of close fighting, and they understood what the river meant. They moved quietly into position as darkness thickened. On the night of March 22, 1945, the first assault boats slid into the Rhine near Oppenheim, their outlines swallowed by black water and colder air. There was no roaring barrage to cover them, no sky filled with friendly aircraft. The soldiers paddled into the current with the feeling that at any second a searchlight would snap on. Machine guns would rip the water into splinters, and the river would swallow the attempt whole. But the far bank did not erupt the way nightmares predicted. The German defenders were not a solid wall. They were fractured remnants, men without confidence, without cohesion, some barely clinging to orders that no longer made sense. In places, the resistance was confused and sporadic. In others, it was absent. The assault waves gained the far shore, secured small footholds, and pushed inland before the defenders could decide whether to fight or flee. By midnight, a bridgehead existed, By the first light of March 23rd, more regiments were across, and engineers were already working under pressure to build pontoon bridges that could carry the weight of an army. Casualties were shockingly low for such a risky operation. The crossing felt like theft. Patton had stolen a river. In the early morning, Patton called Bradley, and the conversation became legend because it sounded like a man trying and failing to pretend he did not enjoy what he had done. He told Bradley, almost conspiratorially, that he was across. Bradley, stunned, demanded to know across what. Patton answered with the river's name, as casually as if he had crossed a road. He suggested secrecy, as if the river itself might change its mind and try to pull the bridgehead back into the water. But the secrecy was never going to last, because the real target was not only the East Bank, it was Montgomery. Within hours, as the bridgehead widened and success became undeniable, Patton called again, and the mask slipped. Now he wanted the world to know. Now he wanted it announced, celebrated, repeated. He wanted headlines timed like artillery, landing exactly when Montgomery's great production began. Patton's crossing was not simply a tactical move. It was a strike at the narrative of Allied command. Bradley understood the power of timing. He also understood that he shared Patton's irritation with British demands and British credit collecting. So the information was released with intent. It was not an accidental leak. It was a deliberate headline designed to detonate just as Operation Plunder opened its curtains. That night, while Patton's engineers expanded their bridges in the south, Montgomery launched his crossing in the north. If Patton's operation had felt like a thief slipping into a house, Plunder felt like an empire arriving with drums. Along the northern front, British and American forces stood in massive formation. 4,000 artillery pieces opened with concentrated fury, pounding the far bank for hours, turning defensive positions into shattered ground. Bombers struck towns and strongpoints, reducing whole blocks to rubble and smoke. The flashes were constant, the thunder unending, a storm made by human hands. When the assault waves moved, they did so with specialized equipment and rehearsed precision. Amphibious vehicles, well-organized boat units, engineers ready to throw bridges across the water with practiced speed. And above it all came the airborne component. Thousands upon thousands of paratroopers dropping or gliding into landing zones east of the river, tasked with grabbing key terrain and disrupting German responses. It was the largest single-day airborne operation of the war, and it added drama to the crossing that Patton's quiet theft could never match. Operationally, Plunder succeeded. Bridgeheads were secured, bridges were built, armor and supplies poured across, and German resistance, though sometimes fierce, could not contain the overwhelming force. Montgomery had done what he always promised to do: plan, prepare, execute, succeed. But in the world of perception, success is not always the same thing as victory. As Montgomery's guns fired and his troops crossed, headlines elsewhere were already arguing about who mattered more. Patton had crossed first. Patton had crossed with less. Patton had crossed without the grand show. In American newspapers, the story wrote itself: the daring American general beating the cautious British field marshal. British papers praised Plunder, but even they struggled to avoid the detail that made the story irresistible. The Americans had slipped across first. Montgomery's public response remained controlled, because his career had taught him the power of a measured pace. But privately, frustration hardened. Staff officers noticed it in his silence, in the way he read the reports, in the sudden sharpness when the subject of Patton arose. What angered him was not only that Patton had crossed early, It was that the narrative implied Montgomery's months of preparation were unnecessary, implying that his discipline was waste, that his professionalism was caution dressed up as leadership. The comparison, in many ways, was unfair. The Northern Rhine was wider, stronger, and defended more seriously than the sector Patton chose. Montgomery's crossing carried heavier strategic responsibility, aimed at opening the route toward Germany's industrial core in the Ruhr. Plunder's scale was not simply vanity. It was designed to ensure that this main effort could not fail, to break open the Northern Gate with certainty. Patton's crossing was an opportunity strike against a shaken defense farther south. Different terrain, different enemy condition, different stakes. None of that mattered in the first wave of public reaction, because war is fought in headlines as much as in mud. And Patton had won the headline war by forcing the world to compare a quiet, nighttime assault to a massive, deliberate set-piece battle. The story made Montgomery look slow. It made Patton look brilliant. It made America look bold, and Britain look cautious. And it did it at the exact moment Montgomery wanted the spotlight for himself. Patton did not help. If Montgomery was the embodiment of controlled professionalism, Patton treated victory as a stage, and himself as the star. After the crossing, he visited the pontoon bridge at Oppenheim like an actor arriving for a curtain call. He made crude jokes, posed for photographs, and behaved with a flamboyance that infuriated British officers who believed war should never be turned into personal theater. At one point, he turned the river into a personal gesture of conquest, announcing his satisfaction in language as vulgar as it was unforgettable. It was Patton in pure form, brilliant, crude, triumphant, and impossible to ignore. Montgomery saw the behavior as childish and unprofessional, proof that American commanders could not resist making everything about themselves. Yet his condemnation carried a bitter weakness, because Patton's showmanship would have been easier to dismiss if the operation had failed. It had not. Patton had crossed, expanded, and held. The river that was supposed to be Montgomery's grand moment had become, instead, a stage shared with a rival who refused to respect the script. Eisenhower, as always, was forced into the role of mediator. He sent congratulations to both commanders, careful with words, praising Montgomery's operation as the official main effort and acknowledging Patton's bold success as an example of American flexibility. Eisenhower could not openly approve the political undermining, but he also could not entirely hide a certain satisfaction. He had endured months of Allied tension and British skepticism about American tactical skill. Now, loudly and publicly, Patton had demonstrated that American forces could seize opportunity and deliver results at speed. It did not make Plunder less impressive, but it did complicate British claims that only careful British method could ensure success. The British High Command knew what had happened. They understood that Bradley's timing was deliberate, and later, Bradley would admit it openly. He had released the news when it would take the most shine off Montgomery's moment. The coalition's unity had always been real, but it had also always been fragile, and now the fractures were visible in ink and radio chatter. British newspapers worked to protect Montgomery's image, emphasizing that Patton's crossing had occurred in a less defended sector, and that Plunder faced heavier conditions. American newspapers celebrated the audacity and implied that Montgomery's months of preparation looked like overkill. In the following days, the debate burned bright, then gradually dimmed under the weight of larger events. The Rhine was crossed in multiple places. Allied armies poured into Germany. The Reich was collapsing, and within weeks, the war in Europe would end. Yet the episode did not fade from memory, because it captured something deeper than a river crossing. It crystallized two philosophies and two personalities into a single dramatic comparison. Montgomery's defenders argued, then and later, that his operation was strategically more significant and far more complex. Plunder was not just a crossing, it was a coordinated breakthrough designed to crack the northern approach into Germany's industrial heartland. It carried a responsibility Patton's southern strike did not. Montgomery's meticulous planning minimized risk and prevented catastrophic failure. The airborne component alone represented a degree of organization and hazard that Patton did not attempt on the Rhine. Montgomery was not slow, they argued. He was ensuring success. Patton's admirers countered that war rewards the commander who recognizes opportunity and moves before the enemy can recover. They argued that Patton's crossing demonstrated exactly what American doctrine valued: flexibility, speed, audacity, and the ability to exploit collapse before it hardens into resistance. They saw the Rhine not as a sacred barrier requiring months of preparation, but as a challenge that could be solved by will, planning done in advance, and relentless momentum. To them, Patton did not merely cross a river. He proved a point. Montgomery himself, in later reflections, could not entirely dismiss Patton's achievement, even if he fought against the comparison. He insisted the two crossings were not equal: different conditions, different enemy strength, different strategic weight. Yet even in acknowledging the differences, he admitted that Patton possessed the dash and leadership that made him exceptionally effective in fast exploitation. It was praise offered with restraint, the closest Montgomery would come to openly applauding a man he believed was too dangerous to admire. Patton, for his part, never softened. He believed Montgomery's caution gave enemies time, and he believed history would remember speed more kindly than certainty. His private writings carried that conviction like a badge. He did not want to minimize casualties if minimizing casualties meant prolonging the war and allowing the enemy to rebuild. He preferred to gamble and win quickly rather than wait for a guarantee and lose momentum. That belief made him lethal on the battlefield and exhausting in coalition politics. Eisenhower, writing with the careful diplomacy of a commander who knew he would be judged on unity as much as victory, tried to balance both stories. He praised Montgomery's planning and execution, and praised Patton's opportunism and flexibility. Publicly, he framed the crossings as complementary achievements that together broke open Germany's final natural defense. Privately, he recognized the truth everyone in the headquarters tents already understood. Bradley's timing was political, and it was meant to put Montgomery in his place. Eisenhower may not have endorsed the bitterness, but he could not claim he was shocked by it. When the war ended, both commanders could point to staggering accomplishments. Patton's Third Army had driven hundreds of miles from the beaches of Normandy deep into the Reich, capturing enormous numbers of prisoners and tearing through enemy formations that often seemed unable to react quickly enough. Montgomery's forces secured the northern route, pushed toward the Baltic, and accepted German surrender in his sector. Both men did what history ultimately demands of commanders. They delivered results. They helped end the war. And yet, for many, the Rhine crossing episode remained the symbol. One river, two styles, two nations, two egos so large they could not share a victory without fighting over the spotlight. Patton's night crossing at Oppenheim became the emblem of American aggression and instinct, an army that moved before the enemy realized it was already too late. Montgomery's Plunder became the emblem of British professionalism and controlled power, an operation built to succeed, even if the enemy had been stronger than expected. When Montgomery died decades later, obituaries praised his victories and his discipline, his method, and his accomplishments. They mentioned his Rhine crossing as one of his finest achievements, but many of them also included the detail they could not resist because it was too perfect, too revealing, too human. that Patton crossed first, beating the carefully scheduled operation by hours, stealing the initial thunder of the moment Montgomery had prepared so long to own. In that detail, the rivalry lives forever. Two great commanders, two different philosophies. One river that became a verdict not only on tactics, but on what the world finds irresistible in war, whether it is the assurance of careful planning or the shock of audacity in the dark.